couple of things. First of all, I think I ended off last time by reading through Mishnah Gimel and saying that we'll look at it this week, but before we do, a couple of things I want to mention from Mishnah Bet. So in Mishnah Bet, we said Haroeh Kohen Gadol Kashu Korei Eno Roeh Par V'Seir Anisrafim. Right. So whoever sees the Kohen Gadol when he's reading, in other words, reading the Torah, does not see the bull and the goat as that are being burnt, and vice versa. Haroeh Par V'Seir Anisrafim Eno Roeh Kohen Gadol Kashu Korei V'Lo B'nei Shon Eno Rishai, not because one is not allowed, because it was far away, and the work of the two of them was equal as one, or was this. Well, so here that I didn't dwell on that. I wanted to mention about this last line. What does this last line mean? So it said, just to go over this last couple of lines. So if you see the Kohen Gadol when he's reading, you would not see the Par and Seir that had to be taken outside of Yerushalayim to be burnt. And not because you're not allowed to see both of them, but because it's just physically impossible, it's geographically impossible. And because, right, so that's the idea that it's geographically impossible. It was far away. In other words, one was far away from the other. And the work of both of them was equal as one. So what does that last line mean? What does it mean that the work of both of them was equal as one? What is that supposed to tell us?
It's a single continuous avodah.
What is a single continuous avodah?
These two geographically separated components.
So what you want to say is that
I'm actually being a little bit hasty here because I can't remember what the two components were.
Well, I just said the two components are the Kohen Gadol who's reading the Torah, and the Par and the Seir that are being burnt outside of Yerushalayim.
Okay, so I take back what I just said. I was spacing out there. I'm sorry.
Well, I want to stay with that for a minute, even if you were spacing out. In other words, the end of the Mishnah is supposed to explain why it is that one doesn't see both of these things, right? You either saw one or you saw the other. And so the first part of the answer, it's not because he's not allowed to see both of them, but because it's far away, implying, like I said, geographically, they're too far away. The Kohen Gadol is reading. Where is the Kohen Gadol reading the Torah? Do you remember?
It is in the Azarah, in the Beit HaMikdash, but outside, certainly not in the Kodesh Kodeshim, but in the Azarah.
So what we said is he's reading in the Ezrat Nashim specifically, right? So the Ezrat Nashim. By the way, Michael, thank you for the Michael Werner sent me pictures. Thank you for those. They're fine as far as they go. They don't give the whole layout of Har HaBayit, which is too bad. I think there are other. I don't know. I keep meaning. Over the years I've drawn some of my own pictures, and I actually recently bought some graph paper to try to do this a little bit better. And I have another book at home, but whatever. They're good references. Just if you want to know generally where things are, they're fine. Anyway, so right? So that we're saying that you can't see both of them because one is too far away from the other. But then this last line, the malacha, both of them is equal as one.
Actually, so I would maybe correct what I said, and I would say that, hearing the reading and witnessing the sacrifice of the par is a same continuous opposite.
And what would be the point of that? I'm not. First of all, I want to point out something. The Mishnah here, interestingly, doesn't say the one who hears the Kohen Gadol when he's reading.
Fair enough.
Right? It's that he sees the Kohen Gadol reading, which is an interesting point unto itself, which may imply that even if you're in the Ezrat Nashim, you might not hear exactly what he's reading. I can imagine Ezrat Nashim is pretty big. I think it's 100 by 100 amot, and wherever he's reading from, it's probably crowded. So I don't know. So here's the thing. Before we try to answer that in a particular way, I just want to show you there are other girsaot in this Mishnah. The girsa in K'tav Yad Kaufman, which we've looked at before, it ends off differently. It says, "Lo mibnei she'eno rashai el shahayta derech rechoka, u'melechet shnehem hayta ka'achat." The malacha of both of them, it's both the reading and the burning of the par and the seir, was as one. Or that would imply hayta ka'achat. What would that imply? What does it mean ka'achat? Melechet shnehem hayta ka'achat. It's just, it's what you say in Hebrew. It just means.
At the same time?
Say that again?
At the same time, simultaneous?
Yeah, they're simultaneous. In other words, in this reading, in this girsa, the last line is just a continuation of the previous line. In other words, the person who saw one would not see the other because it was far away and they were both being done at the same time. In other words, because you might say, well, he could have watched the Kohen Gadol read and then gone and seen the Parva Seir HaNisrafim, but it's saying he wouldn't have been able to do that because the time of the burning is exactly at the time of the reading. And there's a similar girsa in the Yerushalmi, which, just a second. Yeah, in the Yerushalmi, it sounds even a little bit more explicit. It says, right here it's more explicit. The actions of both of these things, of the reading and the Parva Seir, were done at the same time. So this raises, in my mind, an interesting question about, so what does our girsa mean? So our girsa says, U'melachet shnehen shava ka'achat. The malacha of both of them was equal. They were the same. So you could argue that it was just that maybe that's the way they said it. In other words, it might have been a linguistic thing, and that's the way they said it was as one. In other words, that they were done at the same time. It could mean the same thing. I think you could also understand it though in a different way. I've just been playing with this in my head for the last week. So because I didn't find somebody who talked about this specific issue. The simple understanding is the way the Girsa is in the Yerushalmi and the Ketav Yad. The simple understanding is that because they were done at the same time, you couldn't see both of them. So that's fine. And I explained last week why you couldn't see both of them, because the Kohen Gadol is reading in the Ezrat Nashim, and the burning of the Parvasir is outside of Yerushalayim in the north side. And if you're standing in the Ezrat Nashim, there's no way you could see outside to there, because you're also at a different elevation, and it was far away, and so forth. In other words, it wasn't so far away that if you walk there, it wouldn't take that long to walk there. But you can't be standing in one place and see the other place. And I was even trying to think about this, if you were standing on the wall of the Beit HaMikdash, if you could possibly see it, and that even then, I think it might, I think it's not possible. But what does it mean, Melechet Shneihen Shava Ke'achad? This, I think, it has other implications. And what's interesting is that the burning of the par and the Seir is mandated by the Torah explicitly. Right? It's in Achrei Mot, which we'll look at a little bit again today. The reading of the Torah is not explicitly mandated. I mentioned that there's a reference in the first parak that in the Shmonat Yemei HaMiluim, apparently on the 8th day, that there's an idea the Gemara has that the parsha of the Miluim had to be read. And it's not explicit in the Torah, but there's an allusion to it in the Torah that Chazal understood to mean that it had to be read. The Yerushalmi here also tries to find a pasuk, some kind of a mandate in the Torah for the Kohen Gadol to read, but it seems like in any event, the reading of the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippurim is probably not D'oraita, it would be D'Rabbanan. And so if you say Melechet Shneihen Shava Ke'achad, meaning that they're of equal importance, which is another way of understanding it, that might be a simpler way of understanding the words, that their malacha was of equal importance, that would be an interesting reading, because then it would say that, reading the Torah, even if it was only mandated Midrabanan, was on par with watching the Parvasir being burnt.
But Shel?
Yes.
Is the schrifa of the של הפר והשעיר, is this considered as avodah? Or is this just something outside? Because it seems that the reading of the Torah looks like avodah. Or I don't know if Chazal were the ones who introduced it, or if it is an old tradition. But again, is the Srifa of the Sa'ir and the Par, is this considered as avodah?
Yeah, so the burning of the Parvasir is avodah. It's mandated in the Torah itself. As we'll see, we saw it already, but we'll see in Achrei Mot, it says that they have to be burnt. So
this means that if Chazal indeed introduced this reading of the Torah, they introduced it at some point where usually the Kohen Gadol doesn't do anything, just waiting that that these animals outside are being burned, and he does it during the same time.
So this is apparently what's happening. In other words, the burning of the par and the seir is avodah, but it's not avodah that's done by the Kohen Gadol, done by other people. So in terms of timing, it seems like a reasonable idea, right? Because there's still only a limited amount of time in the day. It seems like this would be a reasonable interlude for the Kohen Gadol to read the Torah. In terms of whether or not reading the Torah is avodah, I think we talked about it last time. There's an indication that it's not technically avodah. What's the indication that it's not technically avodah?
The clothes of the Kohen Gadol.
Right. So what did we learn? What clothes does he wear when he reads?
He reads them in his regular clothes as opposed to the special clothes for Yom Kippur.
Can you tell me where it says that in the Mishnah?
Not offhand, no.
Okay, you don't have a Mishnah open in front of you. Okay, so I'll just remind you, what you said is we have to tweak it a little bit. So this is the beginning of the first Mishnah. Balo Kohen Gadol likrot, imatza likrot bevigdei butz korei, v'imlo korei b'itztalit lavan mishalom. So he had a choice. If he wanted to, he could read them in the big day boots, which are the clothes that he wears special for Avodah Yom Kippurim. But he doesn't have to. He could also read them in his own clothing, in a white chaluk, right? A white shirt of his own. Not exactly. Now, it still indicates maybe not his regular clothes, because actually at the end of, in the next Mishnah, in Mishnah Daled, we'll see he goes back to his regular clothes, whatever his regular clothes are. But either way, we understand from Mishnah Aleph that this is not considered to be technically avodah, because he doesn't have to wear clothing that's specific to the Kohen Gadol when he does it. So to get back to my point, I didn't want to linger on this too long, but I do think it's quite interesting. So either it means the way it says explicitly in the other Girsa'ot, that one could not see both of these things, the Kriya and the burning of the Parva Seir, because they were being done at the same time. But another way of understanding it is that somehow they are considered to be equal in stature. So not necessarily because one is D'oraita, one is D'Rabbanan, or something like that, or they're both D'oraita. I could argue Kriyat Torah, even if the Torah doesn't say explicitly that the Kohen Gadol has to read from the Torah now, but reading from the Torah is in itself a mitzvah d'oraita. It's a mitzvah of Talmud Torah. And so it's not avodah and Yom Kippurim per se, but it is a mitzvah of stature.
Well,
Oh, wait, let me just finish that.
okay.
And so maybe what it means is Melechet Shneihen Shavach Achat. What it means is both of them have equal stature, and there's a value in seeing either one of them. There's value in seeing either one. And since you can't see both, so the Mishnah is telling me that whichever one you choose to see, whichever one, if you were there and you choose to see one or the other, they're both of equal value. And that's so even though you can't see both of them, but you should see one of them, and whichever one you see is fine. You know, it's a worthy thing to see. I think that's a different way of right. So that's a way of understanding this girsa that's qualitatively different than the other girsaot, and it's giving you a message. Which I just think that's interesting. And I'll just also remind you that the Bartanur here said, Lo b'nei she'einu rashai, not because he's not allowed to see both of them. Excuse me 1 second. because Mao de Tema, which is saying that the one, if you see one avodah, he's not allowed to leave it to go and look at the other one, because ein ma'avirin al mitzvot, you don't pass over one mitzvah to do another mitzvah. In other words, I might have thought both of these things are mitzvot, and both of them have a value. And if you're at one, you're not allowed to go and then look at the other one, because it would be like you're passing over whichever mitzvah is in front of you to do another mitzvah or participate in another mitzvah. Uriyat avodah, watching the mitzvah, is a mitzvah. Watching the service is a mitzvah. Mishum barov am hadrat melech, because the king is glorified with a multitude of people. Kamash malan delo me'avar mitzvahu. So it comes to teach us, the mission comes to teach us that it's not that he would be, it's not that he's not allowed to see what, both of them, because he would be passing over a mitzvah. Kevan she'eno asuk ba. Dromei avar mitzvahu kevan she'eno asuk ba. He's not, the fact that he's not able to see the other one, it putters him from seeing the, the fact that he's watching one essentially exempts him from seeing the other one. He's not passing over the mitzvah to, it's not, I'm not saying this right. It's not that we're saying that he's not allowed to go see the other one because he would be passing over a mitzvah. It's just that he physically can't go and see both of them. This idea, and the other thing I want to talk a little bit about is Rovam Hadrat Melech, but I'll leave that for a second. And Paul, what did you want to say?
It looks like a kind of compromise. It looks like if some people wanted to introduce this reading of the Torah and other ones didn't want to do it. So they found some kind of compromise that the Kohen is doing it, but doesn't use his usual clothes, and he does it at the same time. You are doing something else. Nowadays, you also have such kind of compromises when people don't agree, like on Yoma Ha'atzmaut, should we say Shem Hashem, shouldn't we say Shem Hashem? So we do some kind of mismatch and just to... Nobody's really pleased.
Well, it's an interesting theory. I'm not sure I agree with it in this regard. I will say about reading the Torah, I don't think that this is done as a compromise. I think this is an interesting thing. Like, we understand that the institution of Torah reading in general was an institution mid'Rabbanan, but we also know that it goes back quite a ways. It goes back certainly until to the time of Ezra, when he gathers everybody together on Rosh Hashanah to read the Torah. And to me, it seems not unreasonable to think that that wasn't a one-off thing, and that maybe even as far back as then, they instituted this idea that we're always going to read the Torah to, that's pertinent to whatever we're doing. I don't know, but that seems to me not unreasonable. And of course, the Torah itself mandates the reading of the Torah publicly in the mitzvah of Hakel at the end of the Shemitah year. Otherwise, the Torah doesn't explicitly mandate the reading of the Torah. Chazal understand that the reading of Parshat Zachor, let's say, is a kiyum of a mitzvah d'oraita, but that's there also the kiyum of it's a kiyum of the mitzvah of Zachor. And the Torah tells you to remember, and Chazal said that the way you will remember, in other words, the way you will fulfill that mitzvah d'oraita of remembering, is by way of reading the Torah. So I put that kind of reading in a kind of separate category in terms of what we're talking about. I think that actually this was probably quite an old institution to have the Kohen Gadol read at this time. I think the timing of it is because there was this, there was a bit of an interlude, but and so I've made the argument that it has, even if it was an institution midrabanan, but witnessing it is its own mitzvah of, witnessing the reading is its own mitzvah because it is an act of Talmud Torah, and Talmud Torah is a mitzvah d'oraita itself. And so, and if you, so the point of the Bartanura is saying about Barovam Hadrat Melech is that you might say, what's the point in just, in watching the par and the seer being burnt? Like, what do you get out of that? So that the idea is that you're simply by bearing witness to that action, you become part of a congregation, part of a multitude, which is just for the greater glorification of God. And that's the idea of Barov Am Hadrat Melech. I started to bring other instances where the Gemara uses this as it's a halachic, it becomes a halachic notion, Barov Am Hadrat Melech. And it's an interesting iyun unto itself. If you look at the pasuk in context in Mishlei, it's not obvious that this is exactly what it's talking about. But the idea is the way it's used elsewhere in halakha is that, the more the merrier, that if you have more people involved in a mitzvah, then that's a greater praise of God. That's a greater glorification of God. So that's the idea of Rov Am, and that's why there would be a mitzvah of watching either one of them, because you would be adding to the number of people watching a particular mitzvah. So anyway, I just thought about this, maybe I don't know, I got stuck on this idea of that the girsa is so much different than what we see elsewhere. I was trying to figure out what it could mean other than what the other girsa says explicitly. So that's my theory. My theory is that in the girsa of the Yerushalmi and the other girsa that I showed you, it's just a continuation of Lo Mibnei Shema Rashai, not because one isn't allowed to see both of them, but it was impossible because it was too far away and they were being done at the same time. So you couldn't see both of them. So that's a logical continuation of Lo Mibnei Shema Rashai. And according to the way I'm learning it, it's Lo Mibnei Shema Rashai El Shaita Derech Rechoka, because they were too far away from each other, but they were both worthy of being seen equally. So there wasn't a reason for you to see one more than the other. And that's the way our Mishnah, that's the way our Girsa seems to be ending off. That's what I have to offer about that. Okay. All right, so now before we go into Mishnah Gimel, this is what I was talking about with Michael Schwartz at the beginning. Let's just remind ourselves of the things that, of the korbanot specifically that have to be brought today. So I made a little chart, which I'm still working on, but let's see, I can make that bigger. There we go. All right. So these are the things that have to be done, and we'll look at the psukim, but just to remind us. So we have to, the korban tamid has to be brought, because that has to be brought every day, right? So that's one keves, right? Keves echad taseh b'boker v'keves hasheni taseh bein ha'arbayim. So that's one keves. So that's the big days. He has to do that. The Kohen Gadol does that wearing the big day zahav, and then he wears the big day lavan, and he has to do the Avodah of Yom Kippurim. So he has to bring a par for him and for the Kohanim. He has to bring a seir for Am Yisrael, and he has to bring an ayil, also for the Kohanim and also for Yisrael. And then in Parshat Pinchas, right, the Musaf, he has to bring a par, the Olah, and 7 klasim, and then Sir Echad lechatat, right, which we also call the Sir Hadnaseh b'chutz. And that's also Bigdei Zahav, and then Bigdei, right, in other words, that's Bigdei Zahav, the Musafin will be done in the Bigdei Zahav, even though those are specific to Yom Kippur. But the Musaf, the institution of the Korban Musaf, is something that was done on every Shabbat and every holiday. So it's not special for Yom Kippur that he's doing Korban Musaf. And then he has to do the Tamid Shel Bein Arbaim, which is another keves. It's Bigdei Zahav. So according to this count, he's going to do altogether 15 behemot, which is a lot of slaughtering to do. Sorry, just bear that in mind. Now, one of the other things we need to bear in mind is that Chazal had a tradition that on Yom Kippur, the Kohen Gadol is going to go to the mikveh 5 times, and he's going to wash his hands and legs 10 times, right? So the count is going to be like this. He has to start off in the morning by doing the Kiddush Yadayim V'Raglayim and going to the mikveh and putting on the Bigdei Zahav to start the Avodah of the morning, and then to wash his hands and legs again. He's going to do that in Bigdei Zahav. He's going to do, so every time he changes one set of clothing for another set of clothing, he has to do that ritual of Kiddush Yadayim V'Raglayim, Tvilah, and then Kiddush Yadayim V'Raglayim, right? So that's how you get. So it means that there has to be, you have to have, how many changes of clothing are we going to have? So it means he's going to be wearing the Bigdei Zahav 3 times, and he'll be wearing the Bigdei Lavan 2 times. So the Bigdei Lavan here, most of it we've already covered in the Mishnah, is because he'll have to do the Par, the Seir, and the Elim, which we'll talk about today. And what's the other time that he has to wear Bigdei Lavan? What else is left for him to do in the Bigdei Lavan?
Ketoret.
No. What Ketoret? You mean?
Never mind. No, never mind. I was getting things. No, I was thinking. I was thinking that like when he's bringing the blood in. No, okay, so no, it's not a distinct part. It's part of the Avodah, bring the blood into the Kodesh Kodashim.
Right. I mean, I haven't listed here all the things he does in the Bigdei Lavan, but yes, there was before he sprinkles the blood. So, the first thing he has to do is he has to go into the Kodesh Kodashim and put down the Ketoret. And then he's going to go out, and then he's going to bring in the blood for the par, and he'll bring in the blood of the seir, and so forth, and he'll do all of that. We haven't yet gotten to the Elim, so at least in the Mishnah, that's the Mishnah we're going to do now, Mishnah Gimel. But just to remind you, the other thing that the Torah says that he has to do is, wait a second. The other thing that the Torah says he has to do, בא אהרון אל אוהל מועד ופשט את בגדי הבד אשר לבש בבואו אל הקודש ונחם שם. That this is after after the sending out of the Seir Azazel, the Torah says that at that point he has to be wearing the Bigdei Habad, he has to go into the Kodesh HaKodeshim and leave his clothes there. So this is a little bit, we talked about this when we first learned these psukim, that nobody thinks that nobody takes this literally, that he goes into the Kodesh HaKodeshim and strips naked and leaves the Bigdei Habad there. But he does go into the Kodesh HaKodeshim, and Chazal say he had to go in order to remove the machteh that had the Ktoret. So he has to wear the Bigdei Habad for that. Okay, this is still all a little bit confusing. I'm going to try to make order of it, and I don't think we're going to finish the whole thing today. But these are the things that we have to keep in mind. These are all the things that had to be done that day. So that's one set of information. And then the other information we have is that there is this tradition that he has to change his clothes 4 times, right? So he has to wear the Bigdei Zahav, he has to change into the Bigdei Lavan, he has to change into the Bigdei Zahav, he has to change in the Bigdei Lavan, and then he has to change back to the Bigdei Zahav, right? So it's 5 different things, which means there's 4 changes of clothing. And each time, but we're going to count the first one, because before he can put on the Bigdei Zahav, he also has to do the Kiddush Yadayim V'Raglayim Tzvila and Kiddush Yadayim V'Raglayim. So it's how do we put all these things together? What's the timeline? What's the specific timeline that's going to allow him to do all these things? Because if I was just going based on the psukim as they appear in Acharei Mot, it's not clear to me that I would have so many changes of clothing, because let's just think about this in our head as we go look at the psukim, right? Vayomer Hashem al Moshe deber Aaron al Chitcha Yavo b'Chait al Kodesh beit l'Parochet al Kapor asher Aaron v'lo yamut ki be'anan yireh al Kapor b'zot yavo Aaron al Kodesh b'char ben b'kar chotat v'ayil echad k'tonet bat Kodesh yilbash. Right. So here the Torah specifically mandates that when he's going to be bringing the par and lechatat and the ayil la'olah, he should be wearing the Bigdei Bad. But of course, throughout all of this, right, in Parshat Acharei Mot, the Torah doesn't put this together with the other avodah that he has to do for the day. That is, the Torah here doesn't include in its timeline that he has to also do the Korban Tamid Shel Shachar and Tamid Shel Ben Ha'arbayim. We have to put that in. And we understand, based on the Masorah, that those avodot he has to dafka do in other clothing. He has to do that in the Bigdei Zahav. And the idea of Bezot Yavo Aaron el Kodesh is something that's very specific to these avodot that are only done for the sake, only done on Yom Kippurim. So this is the problem. If I was reading if I'm reading Acharei Mot without any other information, then I would say, okay, when at least from the point where he starts to do this avodah for the par of the Kohen Gadol, he has to be wearing the Bigdei Lavan, and then he could be wearing the Bigdei Lavan throughout all of this parsha until we get to Pasuk Kaf Gimel, where he goes into the Kodesh HaKodeshim and takes off his clothes and leaves them there. That would be the Pshuto Shel Mikra. That's what's happening. But there are problems with that. One of them is because, I think we'll have time to look at this as the Ramban lays it out. very specific, explicitly that, nobody would think that the Kohen Gadol is going to strip naked in the Kodesh HaKodeshim. That can't be what it means. So we understand it's going to mean something else, but all right, that's part of what we need to deal with. And now, just since we're here, also just to finish off this introduction to the next Mishnah. So let's just remind ourselves. Until now, so he brought the par, and he slaughtered the par, and he brought the seir. He brought their blood into the Kodesh HaKodeshim. He sprinkled it there, and then he brought it into the Kodesh, and he sprinkled it there, and then he sprinkled it on the Mizbeach HaZahav. And then he went out and he did the vidui on the Sir Azazel. Sir Azazel was sent off, and then he's going to go and do the Kriyat Torah while the what's left of the par of the Seir are taken outside of the city and they're burnt, and then what? So here, so we just saw Pasuk Kav Gimel, right? Ba'aron el moed fashad et bigdei abad asher labash b'vo'o el kodesh v'yinicham sham rachatzet b'soro b'mayim b'makom kadosh labash et b'gadav. So here the Torah tells us that he has to go to the mikvah and wear his clothes. So what are the clothes that he's going to be wearing? These will be the big days zahav, because then it's a v'yatzari asad o lo toviyat o la ta'am v'prepare ba'ado v'ad ha'am. Ve'edchelev ha'chatat yaktir ha'mizbecha. That's a reference to the idea that the parvei seir have to be burnt. And then Hamishalech et Seir la'Azazel yichabes begadav v'rachatzet b'sor b'mayim v'achreichen yavo ha'machaneh. So that whoever sent off the Seir la'Azazel, he becomes tamei, and he has to go to the mikvah before he can return into the Beit HaMikdash. V'et parach chatat v'tzir chatat asher huvat tamam l'chaper b'kodesh yutzil michutz ha'machaneh v'sarfu v'eish et orotam v'yetzaram et pirsham. Okay, so this is where explicitly those things are completely burnt. So the Torah mandates their burning very explicitly. That's the Srifat Parvei Seir. The Kohen or any of the Kohanim who burnt them also become Tamei. And yeah, and that's that. Now, and then it goes on to tell us more about Yom Kippurim. But what about the, hold on a second. Right, so what about the Elim that were mentioned earlier, right? So we have the Ayil, just a second. Right, bezot yavoron al kosh b'far ben bekar chatat v'ayil olah, u'meit adat b'nei Yisrael yikach shnei sirei ezim l'chatat v'ayil echad olah. So, what about these elim? Okay, so these are all the things that we need to be keeping in mind as we're learning Mishnah Gimel. This is what and so Michael Schwartz started off by telling me he was a little confused about this. So I just want to tell you, there's a lot to be confused about. And let's try to put this in order.
Thank you.
So Mishnah Gimel says, boots kore. If he's reading with the bigdei boots, right, with the bigdei lavan, then kidesh yadav raglav. Then he washes his hands and legs. Pashat yarad v'taval. He removes his clothes. He goes down into the mikvah and tavels. Alav and istapek, he gets up and he dries himself off. Heviu lo bigdei zahav v'lavash. And then they bring him the bigdei zahav and he gets dressed. V'kidesh yadav reglav. He washes his hands and legs, right? So that's the drill for every time that he changes clothes. V'yatsa, and then he goes out. V'asa et elo et el ha'am. Now he goes out wearing the bigdei zahav, and he does his ayil and the el ha'am. He does his ram and the ram of the up. So that's what we saw at the beginning of the part of Achrei Mot, that in addition to his par, in addition to the seir, the chatat of the Am Yisrael, he has to do an ayil for each. Ve'et shivat kvasim tmimim b'nei shana, and then he also does at this point 7 kvasim, 7 perfect unblemished sheep that are a year old. Divrei Rabbi Eliezer. So what are the shivat kvasim tmimim? What's that for? I just had it up on the chart here. What are the shivat kvasim?
Musaf.
Musaf.
Right, so that's the musaf. Now, why is he doing the elim with the musaf? This is where it's going to start to get more confusing, right? But we actually touched on this question a long time ago, and I just want to point this out again. So here in Parshat Pinchas, Perek Kaftet, it says, "Uvesor lechodesh hashvi'i hazeh mikra kodesh yadachem v'yinitem et nafshotechem kol melacha lo ta'asu v'ikravtem ola l'Hashem reich nichoach par ben bekar echad ayil echad kvasim v'nei shana shivat tmimim v'yiyu." So part of the Korban Musaf was to bring a par and an ayil. Minchatam sodu abashemen, you have to bring the korbanot mincha and so forth. And then Zohar by saying sirizim echad chatat. That's the sir of chatat. That's the sir hamaseh b'chutz. Milvad chatat kippurim, ilata tamidu min chatav niskehem. Aside from the chatat kippurim, ilata tamidu niskehem. So there's some things here that we need to understand what exactly they are. And one of them is the ayil. What about this ayil? Is this the same ayil that we saw back in Achrei Mot? Just a second. It's not Rashi. Hold on. Let's go back here. Oof. Okay, I apologize, but there's a machloket tanaim about the ayil. Is the ayil that's mentioned in Parshat Pinchas the same ayil that was mentioned in Achrei Mot, or is it in addition to the ayil that was mentioned in Achrei Mot? The way that I've counted in my little chart here is based on the idea that it's the same, that there are only 2 elim. I could argue that in Achrei Mot, there's an ayil of the Kohen Gadol, there's an ayil of the Am, and then in Parshat Pinchas, there's another ayil, which we just read about. But we're going with the idea that the ayil that's mentioned in Parshat Musafin, in Parshat Pinchas, is the same as the ayil of the Kohen Gadol. And that's how you get this count of 15. Otherwise, you would have a count of 16. I apologize. We looked at that sugya a long time ago, and I should have brought it up. And I'm not going to try to bring it up right now, but we'll come back to it. Okay, let's just say, according to Rebbe Eliezer, at this point, this is what he does. At this point, after he's read the Torah, he changes his clothes, and then he does Elovet El Ha'am and Shivat Kvasim Tamimim. Okay? Rabbi Akiva Omer, Im Tamid Shel Shachar Hayu Krevim. They are brought with the Tamid Shel Shachar. Par Ha'olah, B'sir Hanaseh B'chutz, Hayu Krevim Im Tamid Shel Ben Ha'arbayim. By the way, so there's another way of also reading this. Rabbi Akiva Omer, Im Tamid Shel Shachar Hayu Krevim Ufar Ha'olah. That maybe Ufar Ha'olah is really the end of this sentence here. And then Sir Hanaseh B'chutz, Hayu Krevim Im Tamid Shel Ben. That's, I'll come back to that. Maybe we'll do that sugya next week. I think that's going to get too confusing. Let's just read it the way I've laid it out here. So Rabbi Akiva Omer, Im Tamid Shel Shachar Hayu Krevim. All right, so Rabbi Akiva says they were brought with the Tamid Shel Shachar. What was brought with the Tamid Shel Shachar?
The Ayolim?
Yeah, the Elim and
the scene.
the Kvasim. In other words, to put it a little differently, Rabbi Akiva would say that the Musaf was brought with the Tamid Shel Shachar. That unlike after he did the Tamid Shel Shachar, he would go on right then when he was still in the Bigdei Zahav and do the Korbanot Musaf. He would do the Elim, which would now be considered like a Musaf, and the Shivat Kvasim Tamimim. But we also saw one of the other aspects of the Musaf is the Sir Hanaseh B'chutz, the Sir Chatat, and the Par Ha'olah, right? Those are the two other things that are mentioned in Parshat Pinchas. There's a Par Ha'olah, that's how it starts off, and it ends off with the Sir Hanaseh B'chutz. So he says those things, the Par Ha'olah, the Sir Hanaseh B'chutz, Hayu Krevim Im Tamid Shel Ben Ha'arbayim. Those would be brought later with the Tamid Shel Ben Ha'arbayim. So, before we look at the Bartanura, let's just understand what we can about the machloket between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Akiva. So, and actually before we get to that, let's just make a comment about the beginning of the Mishnah. The beginning of the Mishnah says, so if he had read in the Big Day Boots, then at this point he's going to do the Kiddush Yadayim V'Raglayim and so forth and change his clothes. But what if he had read in the Itztalit? Then what? What would he have done then? This is what he does if he read in the Big Day Boots. But what if he had already taken off the Big Day Boots?
Wouldn't he have to put them back on in order to do the service for Yom Kippur?
Well, the thing is, the next service that he's going to do is in any event going to be in the Big Day Zahav. That's the Mishnah here. That's our Mishnah. Because if he is wearing the Big Day Boots, then he has to go now and change into the Big Day Zahav. If he wasn't wearing the Big Day Boots, he was wearing the Itztalit, and he would still have to change into the Big Day Zahav. But what happened? What was the procedure for him changing from the Big Day Boots into the Itztalit? So that's not explicit in the Mishnah. That's not explicit in the Mishnah, but in a second. The Tosfos Yom Tov here brings, right? Di'ilu karabi itztalit. He brings this from the Rosh. Di'ilu karabi itztalit. if he had been reading with the wearing his itztalit, kvar kidesh kodem shepashat bigdei boots. He would have already washed his hands and legs before removing the bigdei boots, right? Because that's part of the procedure of changing clothes regardless. He was going to have to wash his hands and legs. So, so what would remain for him now to get into the Bigdei Zahav is just to go to the mikveh and then put on the Bigdei Zahav and then wash his hands and legs. All right, so this is a prat katan, but worth pointing out. Whenever he removes his clothing, he has to do kiddush yadayim v'raglayim. So when he removed the bigdei lavan and changed into the itztalit, he had to have washed his hands and legs then. So he doesn't have to repeat washing his hands and legs if he read in the itztalit. And that's why the Mishnah says, im bevigdei boots kore. If he had been reading with the bigdei boots, now he'll do the kiddush yadayim v'raglayim. But if he had been reading with the itztalit, he would go straight to removing the itztalit and taveling and then putting on the bigdei zahav. So that's the chidush, as it were, of this Mishnah, that that procedure is going to be done now full if he had been wearing the bigdei boots, but if he'd been wearing the itztalit, he already did the first part of the procedure, which was to do kiddush yadayim v'raglayim. Okay, hevil lo bigdei zahav, so forth. V'yatzav asad elo v'et el ha'am. So he's going to go out and do the ayil, his ayil and the ayil and the el ha'am, and shivat kvasim t'mimim b'nei shana. Divi Rabbi Eliezer. So Rabbi Eliezer says, okay, this is what he does, but what does Rabbi Eliezer not say? In other words, of the various korbanot that he still has to do. So Rabbi Eliezer says, okay, he'll do the 2 elim and he'll do the shivat klasim, but what other korbanot does he still have to do that Rabbi Eliezer doesn't mention?
There's the Tamid Shel Ben Arbaim.
So he still has to do Tamid Shel Ben Arbaim. He also still has to do what? From the Musaf. He still has to do the Par Ha'olah and the Sir HaNaseh B'chutz. So when the Machloket, so one way of reading the Mishnah is to read it like this. And that's the end of Rabbi Akiva's statement. And then when it says that's everybody. That's both Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Eliezer. That they both agree that the Para Olah V'Sir Nasa B'chutz would be brought with Tamid Shel Ben Ha'arbayim. So what's the machloket then between, if that's true, what's the machloket between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Akiva? That according to Rabbi Akiva, what Rabbi Eliezer is saying is only done now to bring the elim and the kvasim, only done now, meaning only after all the other avodot were done already for the sprinkling of the blood and the Sir Azazel and Kriyat Torah and Parvasir HaNisrafim and so forth. Only now is he going to do the Ayil and the Shivat Kvasim. And then presumably, according to Rabbi Eliezer, he would then continue to do the rest of the Musaf, Parv HaOlah V'Sir Nasa B'chutz, and then do the Tamid Shel Ben Arbaim. The Tamid Shel Ben Arbaim is going to be the last thing he does, right? Because the Tamid is always the last thing that's done. And according to Rabbi Akiva, he's saying, no, actually, im tamid shel shachar hayu krevim. These things, the elim and the shivat kvasim tamimim, those were actually brought much earlier. Those were brought at the beginning after he did the korban tamid, he did the elim and the kvasim, and then he changed into the bigdei boots, and then he did the par and the seer, the chatat. Sorry. So that's a simple way of understanding their machloket. So let's see how the Bartanura says. So the Bartanura says, "V'yatzav yasat elo v'et el ha'am, elo ve'el ha'am." So ta'amad Rabbi Eliezer, the reason of Rabbi Eliezer is mishum de'elo ve'el ha'am ve'emurei chatat v'hotzat kafu machta kol hani dichtive bereisha b'torat kohanim b'parashat hayom aved lehu bereisha. Right? That his ayil and the ayil of the Am and the Emurei Chatat that had to be burnt and removing the Kafu Machta, which, right, that's, as I said, this is how Chazal understand in Pasuk Kaf Gimel that he goes into the Kodesh HaKodeshim at the end, V'hi nicham sham, and he leaves his clothes there, but we understand what he goes in to do actually is to remove the Kafu Machta, and we'll look into that more carefully probably next week. But that's the last of his avodot in the Bigdei Lavan, to remove the Kafu Machta. So according to Rabbi Eliezer, all of those things he did before, V'hadar Aved Musafim, and afterwards he would do the Musafim. So what are the Musafim? Par ha'olah, V'shiva kvasim, V'sa'ir hanaseh b'chutz, kulan im tamid shel ben ha'arbaim, dichtiv lebasof b'chumash ha'pkudim. So, in the words of Rabbi Eliezer, he doesn't mention Har ha'olah and Sir hanaseh b'chutz, but one way I say of understanding the Mishnah is that because that's the end of the Mishnah, and you would read this as if it's saying that Rabbi Eliezer is saying that at this point he goes out, he does the Elim, he does the Shivat Kvasim, he does the Par HaOlah and the Sir Hanaseh B'chutz, along with, and then ending off with the Tamid Shel Ben HaArbaim. Just a second. All right. Rabbi Akiva Omer Par HaOlah b'Shivat Kvasim Shel Musafim Im Tamid Shel Shachar Hayu Krevim. Now, so Rabbi Akiva is going on the words of Rabbi Eliezer, Yet Shivat Kvasim Tamimim B'nei Shana, and even though he doesn't mention the Par HaOlah, then maybe that's implied. Par HaOlah v'Shivat Kvasim Shel Musafim, because once I say Shivat Kvasim Tamimim B'nei Shana, I understand that I'm going to bring the Musaf. So that means I would also bring the Par HaOlah. He says, Im Tamid Shel Shachar Yukrevi. Dichtiv milvad olat haboker shel olat hatamid. Alma, we'll look at that pasuk in a moment. Alma musafim im olat haboker nasim b'samuch la v'char kach avodat hayam. So it tells me that the musafim were brought with the olat haboker, right next to it. That's the implication of the pasuk. And afterwards, avodat hayom, which would be the par and the seir whose blood gets sprinkled inside. V'achar kach seir hanaseh b'chutz. And then afterwards, you do the seir chatat that's brought down in Parshat Musafim. V'af al pi shehu min musafim, even though the Siyar Na'aseh b'chutz is also a musaf, eino yachol lahakdim la'avodat hayom. You can't bring it before the avodah that you have to do for the day of Yom Kippur. V'fi shene'amar bo milvad chatat kippurim. Because it says about the Siyar Na'aseh b'chutz that you do it milvad, aside from the chatat kippurim. Lamadnu shesir hapnimi shuhu me'avodat hayom kodmo. That tells me that the seir hapnimi, that's the seir whose blood gets sprinkled inside, that has to be done prior to the seir hanaseh b'chutz. V'char kach elo ve'el ha'am, v'char kach emurei chatat, kol elu b'tvilah shlishit. All of these things are in the third tvilah. So you see the Bartanura he's kind of changing and adding things into the reading of the Mishnah that are not clear in the Mishnah. So we have to go through these things even more carefully, and we'll see if we can get through this now. And this Michael Schwartz, this is what becomes very, very confusing. This becomes very confusing. But let's just go back for a moment and look at the psukim again in Bamidbar. And let's understand what's at stake here. So Yikravtem, so this is the Korban Musaf. Yikravtem Ola Hashem Reich Nichoach, Parben ben Karachad, Ayil Chad, Kvasim ben Eshana, Shivat Tamimim Yulachem. Now, because these are all brought in a single pasuk, one would assume that they're all brought together. Like whenever you figure out you're going to bring them, presumably you're going to bring them all together. We'll skip the Korbanot Mincha, we'll go to the last part. And then you also have to bring Seir Izim Echad Chatat. Now this is not grouped together with the Par and the Ayil and the Shivat Kvasim. It's brought as an addendum, as it were, which is true for all of the Moadim, that the Seir Izim Echad Chatat is always brought at the end. But what it says in the pasuk is Seir Izim Echad Chatat Milvad Chatat Kippurim. This is brought besides the Chatata Kippurim. So what's the Chatata Kippurim? So that's what we just said. The Chatata Kippurim, Rashi here tells us, Seir Hanaseh Bifnim Ha'amur Be'achrei Mot, Shegam Hu Chatat, right? So the Seir Hanaseh Bifnim, the par of the Kohen Gadol, and the Seir La'am, those are both korbanot chatat. So when the Torah here says that the Seir Izim Echad Chatat that's being brought here, that's being brought besides the Chatata Kippurim, that's being brought besides the Seir Hanaseh Bifnim, that implies to me, Rabbi Akiva says, that I can't bring the Seir Chatat, this seir, the Seir Hanaseh b'chutz, I can't bring that before I would bring the Seir Hanaseh bifnim. And that's how it gets separated. Even though it's a Korban Musaf, it gets separated from the other Korbanot Musaf of the Par, the Ayil, and the Shivat Kvasim. It gets separated because of this verse that says, Milvad Chatata Kippurim. The Olata Tamid. It's also brought besides Olata Tamid. Right, Rashi says, Milvad Olata Tamid Tasu Olot Halalu. Right, so the Olata Tamid, nonetheless, even though you might argue that maybe I also can't bring the Seir, this Seir Musaf, the Seir Hanaseh b'chutz, before I bring the Olata Tamid of Ben Ha'arbaim. That's a different thing. Here, so the Olata Tamid here, presumably would refer to the Olat Tamid of the Boker. So it means that the Sir, so again, this Pasuk tells me, Sir is Yizim Echad Chatat, which is a Korban Musaf, is going to also be brought, but it's going to be brought besides the Chatata Kippurim and besides Olata Tamid. So when is it going to be brought? So Milvad Chatata Kippurim, Rabbi Akiva tells me, means that I have to bring Chatata Kippurim before I would bring this year Chatat, this year Hanaseh B'chutz. Okay. So that explains how the Sir Hanaseh B'chutz gets brought at a different time than the rest of the Korbanot Musaf. But when are all of the Korbanot Musaf going to be brought? So what we see in the Mishnah is that Rabbi Eliezer wants to say, let's go back to the Mishnah here. Rabbi Eliezer wants to say that the Korbanot Musaf are going to be brought now after he did the Par V'Seir Hanaseh Bifnim. Not immediately after, right, but after. And Rabbi Akiva is going to say, no, those parts of the Korbanot Musaf are going to be brought with the Tamid Shel Shachar. And only the Seir Hanaseh B'chutz is going to, the Par HaOlah and the Seir Hanaseh B'chutz are going to be brought with the Tamid Shel Ben Arbaim, or this is why the other reading is important. Or maybe in Tamid Shel Shachar Yikravim and also the Par HaOlah, because what we understand is that the Seir Hanaseh B'chutz has to be brought later, right before it has to be brought after the Seir Hanaseh Bifnim. Okay, I fear, I'm trying to make this as clear as possible, and I fear that it's still not 100% clear. This is what I would like to do. Let's consider that we did a cursory reading in the Bartanura. I think next week, what I'm going to do, which I think will help, is even though it's not an easy sugya, I want to look at the sugya and the Gemara on this Mishnah so that we can try to understand this better. The Mishnah is written in this confusing kind of way. We understand Bigadol. I'll just summarize now that what we understand, generally speaking, there is this machloket between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Akiva about the Korbanot Musaf. Were they brought with the Tamid Shel Shachar, or were they brought with the Tamid Shel Ben Arbaim? That's more or less the big question here. So we're going to leave that to go into more detail next time. And I think just to finish off today, I don't know if we'll even get through the whole Mishnah next time, but let's just read the next Mishnah. So it's going to put this, because now we're coming to the end of the day. So let's just read the rest of this Mishnah, and then we'll stop. So after he brought these korbanot, whether according to Rabbi Akiva, or whether according to Rabbi Eliezer, but now he's going to be finished with the Tamid. He'll be finished with the Elim and the Musaf. So then he's going to once again wash his hands and legs. He's going to take off the bigdei zahav. He's going to go down and tavel. Heviu bigdei lavan. He's going to put on the bigdei lavan, the lavash, and he's going to get dressed. V'kidesh yadav v'raglav, and then he'll wash his hands and legs again. Okay, so he's changed into the bigdei lavan. What does he do then? Then he goes into the Kodesh HaKodeshim to remove the kaf that he had used to bring the Torah into the Kodesh HaKodeshim. And essentially, that's the only thing he's going to do now, the Bigdei Lavan. This is the second time that he's wearing the Bigdei Lavan. And he just goes in, he removes the kaf and the machteh, then he'll come out, he's going to go, he has to wash his hands and legs, he has to go and tavel, he gets up and he dries, then they'll bring him the bigdei zahav, and he'll get dressed in those, and he has to wash his hands and legs again. Now he's going to do the avodah ben harabim. And once he finishes that, then he's going to go wash his hands and legs again, and then he's going to remove the bigdei zahav. They bring his own clothes, lavash, in other words, whatever his clothes are, because now he's off duty as the Kohen Gadol. He puts on his regular clothes, and then they accompany him to his house. So they made a holiday for him, his friends, at the time that he went out in peace from the Kodesh. And that's the end of the day. Basically, the end of Mishnah Dalet is the end of the whole Seder Hayom. So we also want to see that, but I do want to try to lay out Mishnah Gimel for you in a better way. That's why I started this chart, which I want to expand upon and put in some of the other details. And I'll show you, I'll make it so that you can see it both according to Rabbi Akiva and to Rabbi Eliezer. It'll be easier than me just saying everything. So I think that's it for now. Okay, any last words?
It's less confusing now.
It's a little, in other words, at least now the main thing I wanted to get across today are all the things that we need to take into consideration. And that's the most important thing. So the specific reading of the Mishnah is difficult, but now we have like a better idea. These are all the things that have to get covered. When we finish at the end of the Mishnah, if not next week, but then the week after, we'll do a wide review to go hopefully using a better chart than what I made today, to go through all the things that he did. And that'll be that. And then we'll look at the end of Mishnah Zayin, which talks about Perek Zayin, which talks about the Bigdei Kuhuna. And then finally, we'll get to Perek Chet, which is all about Yom Kippur, which is still Halacha L'Maaseh Hayom. We'll do that probably in a couple of weeks. Okay. Thanks, everybody.
Good night. Thank you.
Hold to. Bye-bye.